Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you. Put the question more simply, is monasticism an answer to our times? Now, he's called Petroc, and Petroc was a monk that came from the middle of Wales to the Cornish Peninsula in about 550, and he called the people of Cornwall to conversion, to baptism. But he was a monk, and he lived with other monks in a monastery. Also, in a very appropriate way, today we celebrate the feast of St. Benedict, who is of course, the great founder of Western monasticism. So, monasticism, an answer to our times. Some of you may have some familiarity with monks and what monks do, but put very simply, monasticism or monks are those who come together to live in a community where they share everything in common. They live a life of chastity, a life of prayer, a life of conversion of life, which means the call to poverty. And traditionally, monks and monasteries around the world have been one of the great influences of culture, of civilization. Indeed, to understand this country, understand its history, you have to look at it through the optic of monks. And you often see through some perhaps 1,000 years of our history that monasteries will affect and influence the affairs of a community, of a neighborhood, indeed of a country, of a local area, and beyond. But set that against how we live our lives today, of how we manage our lives. If you like, the role of commerce, of industry, of social communications, of the great ease of travel, of what we are formed in when we go to educational institutions, the great series of world events. And you might quite naturally find yourself saying, well, monasticism is perhaps part of our history books. It's somewhat remote and indeed perhaps irrelevant to how we live our lives. Well, I like to take you on a journey. And the journey really is to reflect upon your own experiences of the last 2 or 3 years during this time of pandemic. And just to ask you, what have you experienced at this time? Whether you are a Christian or a non-Christian, a Catholic, a non-Catholic, an inquirer, someone who may want to know more about the Christian faith. What have you seen? What have you witnessed? What have you learned? What have you experienced? I think all of us would say it's been a very tough and challenging time. It's had its moments of difficulty, its moments of sadness, of pain, and indeed of suffering. And I'd like to offer what I have perceived at this time and what I have seen. I think what I've seen, having lived 64 years, it has been an extraordinary, and this sort of came up the other day when Boris Johnson was accusing his parliamentarians of being herd-like, that once they get the sniff of something, they all act as though they're in a great big herd. But I think what I've seen is that we have seen very herd-like behavior. People have followed the strictures of government, of their employer, perhaps of their local community. And people generally have acted very much in the same way, in a very obedient way. Also, I think it is quite clear to say that many have had the coronavirus, many have seen sickness at first hand, and many will have seen and known people who have died because of it. In other words, it has been a real plague. Also in this time that we can say that the poor have become poorer. There was a great cry of Bob Geldof some years back to make poverty history. He cried that some 30 years ago, particularly in the light of the famines in North Africa. And I think that many who are involved in the world of third world economics and development aid would say that the challenges now facing us, feeding the developing world, are much greater than they were 3 years ago. The poor have become poorer. Also within our local communities, those perhaps who haven't had the advantage of furlough, those who've lived in small houses or small flats, who haven't been able to travel much, perhaps haven't had the facility of educating their children, as well as those perhaps of a more educated kind, that the poor will have suffered greatly. In addition to that, that I would argue that fear was very much part of the narrative, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic. You know, don't kiss your granny because you'll kill her. In other words, don't do all those things which are absolutely natural and germane to you. I think also that uncertainty was very much part of the narrative. And I think that's had a lot of knock-on effects. Loneliness, which is always a great mark of our world, has increased. To be told that you can just live in your house, you can do all your work from your home, that you do not need to go out. And therefore that whole dynamic of sociability, human beings are essentially sociable. We need to be with each other. We need to interact with each other. Also, what has taken a terrible hit at this time is the life of community, if you like, of gathering around the village pump, of being able to, you know, exchange and to share ideas, experiences of a local neighborhood, the local village, or whatever it might be. And then, of course, most painfully, how many families have suffered of not being able to visit elderly relations, those who were considered to be very at risk. And I think some of the anger that people have had at the famous Partygate is that some people seem to find it easy to visit their friends, but many of us had to obey and keep away from loved ones. That has been a secular reality, and I think however you cut it, it has been there. For us as Christians, we had a particular experience that I think many of us never dreamt that we would ever have. And certainly if you go back in the history of the church, it has hardly ever been seen that churches were closed at the beginning of the pandemic. It was a definitive act. Whoever dictated it is up for question and debate. But churches were closed. You could not go into churches to do that most fundamental of human acts, which was to pray to God. Also, essentially, the sacramental life of a church was stopped. You were told you didn't have to go to Mass, you didn't have to go to confession, you know, etc., etc. And then our faith, Lawrence got some, oh, Sylvia, come and pray. You managed to get in all right, well done. Is that door still open?
Yeah.
Is it? Yeah. That we could watch religious services, we could watch Mass online. Now, I think many of us would have questions about that. What has been the long-term effect on it? And I think it has left many Christians somewhat divided and some critical of their church leaders. As a consequence of that, pre and post-COVID, we have seen a fall-off in numbers of people going to church. for us as Catholics. There are many dioceses, there are many parishes up and down the land who will say that the numbers of people who were going to church pre-COVID and post-COVID, even though we've had some 6 months of normality, have seen a considerable diminishment. People seem to have stopped practicing their faith. In addition to that, I think there's a certain perception of people who see that the church evolved in that time of pandemic, not so much as a house of God, perhaps as a place of sacred encounter, but something perhaps more akin to a non-governmental organization as it obeyed the diktats of government. You can debate this, but certainly there is that perception. Now, I'd like to take you back some 1100 years to 900 AD. Now, I don't know if many of you have Danish friends, and most of us think of Denmark as the place of herrings, and there's wonderful nice spicy pieces of fish that you get. But the Danes, or the Vikings, 1,000 years ago, were a formidable group of people. They were fierce, they were warlike, they were great invaders and conquerors, and they certainly did not have Christian religion. Denmark to England was not a long journey by boat. And there was a time, some 50 to 70 years, when many of our religious houses, Christianity essentially came here 400, 450. Many of our religious houses, our convents, our churches, were literally razed to the ground, burnt and destroyed. And the religious life of this country was effectively, it wasn't extinguished as such, but it was considerably attacked and diminished. Now, a revival started and happened in that place that many people have been to in recent weeks, Glastonbury. There was a wonderful article in some paper I saw the other day, which was Why I Hate Glastonbury. Now, why I hate Glastonbury was because of the mounds of rubbish and everything else, and you know, some of the messages which are perhaps put out from Glastonbury. But Glastonbury was the site of an extraordinary religious house. Indeed, it has a history that may have taken it back to the very beginning of a church in this land. St. Dunstan founded or re-established monastic life in Glastonbury in Sussex, in Somerset, in about 900. As a result of that monastery, as a result of that kind of church government, of that culture, of that civility, Dunstan ushered in a whole new monastic age to this land of England. So Glastonbury was like a pearl. It was a precious piece in the crown. And from that, Dunstan, who then went on to be Bishop of Winchester, Archbishop of Canterbury, he helped to revivify, restore Christianity, which meant the founding of new monasteries, of schools, of making sure that administrators and kings and politicians understood firmly that things like the common law were deeply written in the Judaic-Christian scriptures, that we were a Christian land and had been a Christian land for some 400 years. That new monastic age, what was it about monasticism? What was it about this whole cultural revival which touched all parts of this land and became as normal and as germane to people as knowing who had won the FA Cup, who was in Parliament, who was Prime Minister, what was the price of corn in the local market? Monasticism came to influence and to touch all people's lives. There were monasteries, they came to be found in monasteries, in towns, in cities, great cities like London. There's a very famous monastery very close to here, just down the road in Clerkenwell, around the city of London. All those great names, Blackfriars, Whitefriars, were all significant of a monastic life. So what was it that monasticism enshrined? Well, first of all, at the heart of a monastery is the desire, the complete desire, to put God at the center of all activities and to influence everything that that monastery did. A monastery was an economic unit. It was a farm, it was a factory, it was a place of education. Indeed, all the medical care that you could find in medieval England, you would go to monasteries to find it. It was a place that cultivated, it was a place that produced produce. But at the heart of that community was the call to worship God, to adore God, and for God, through the influence of revelation, to order the lives of people, to order the lives of people. Now, we have our lives ordered, if you like, by what we draw down from the internet, what our newspapers tell us. When we look out and we watch the television and it tells us that it's going to be hot today, we're in the middle of summer or whatever. But what was at the heart of the monastic life, first of all, was a timetable. It was a timetable that went from early in the morning to late at night. It was a timetable that recognized the seasons, that was deeply involved in the season, deeply involved in nature. Through the monks came to have a great and a deep knowledge of horticulture, of herbs, of how to receive the goodness, of how to tend and to care for the land. And lives were structured. People's lives were in a sense structured around the timetable and the pattern of monastic life. Also at the heart of the monastery was what we call the liturgy. Now, liturgy means, very simply, worship. When you go to church to pray, to worship God, you engage in the liturgy, which is the work, the public work of a church. In other words, the day, the week, the month, and the year is infused by the liturgy. So the liturgy, what you do in the church, in a sense, takes you from the farms and the pharmacy and the schoolroom, and then takes you back to the farm, the schoolroom, or the marketplace. And that when we worship God, what is happening is that we are literally, in a sense, freeing ourselves from all our activities and falling into the arms of God. And the act of praying, of praising, of singing the Psalms, one could say, is a great expression of freedom. It's where we are free from the world, able to direct ourselves to God. Fourthly, very importantly, that monasteries taught people how to be ill, how to suffer, how to, in a sense, to embrace sickness. Sickness, if you were living 700, 800, 900 years ago, indeed you could say 100 years ago, was much more radical and real for people's lives than it is today. You know, we of course had the COVID thing, but if you were living around the 1920s and you had to deal with the Spanish flu, which cut a swathe through European countries, up to a quarter to a third of people were swept away by the Spanish flu. COVID essentially was a walk in the park compared to that. Monasteries helped people overcome illness and suffering, because at the heart of the gospel is always a call to bring the healing, mercy, the medicine of God, if you like, into people's lives. Also, what monasteries did very beautifully was it taught people how to die. We are going to die. I went to a funeral today of a dear friend who was exactly the same my age at seminary. He became a priest, in fact, he left the priesthood. He ended up marrying and had a little daughter, and he got a brain tumor, and he died within 5 weeks. Now, the funeral and everything around the funeral indeed was deeply joyful, because he was able to tell his family and friends that he was going to God. But that journey from life to death into eternity is something that monks teach us how to do. If you ever go to a monastery, you will always find as a central part of that monastery the graveyard where the nuns or the monks are buried. And you will see monks walking around the graveyard, praying for and praying with the dead. In a sense, they haven't gone, that they're there. And through the communion of saints, we believe that there is that unity with those who have gone before us. Also, what monastic life was able to do was to confront something which people find very difficult to talk of nowadays, which is the reality of good and evil. How do you explain what happens in the Ukraine? How do you explain what happens in Yemen? How do you explain when the Crown Prince of Saudi was responsible for putting a very fine journalist into a mincing machine as a way to get rid of his body? How do you explain the reality of evil? Do you just say it's when human nature goes wrong? Or do you say that there is such a thing as an objective force of evil, as there is an objective force of good, which is God, which is life of grace? And always what you find in a monastic life is that very real sense of we are here and we are weak, we are inclined to good, we're inclined to do the will of God, but there is a force of evil that always wants to destroy us and to undermine us. And monasteries have always been, and some of you will be familiar with the St. Benedict medal, that it's a very powerful force for good. Also, what monasteries have traditionally done is that they teach people how to love. Now, you might think that's a bit odd. Monasteries are made up only of men living together and women living together. And when we think of love today, we think of a sort of much wider field, if you like. If you've ever lived in community, we have 2 seminarians here who are living in community. It ain't easy. You have to put up with people that you don't particularly care for. You have to live with people's strange habits. You have to be generous with your time. You have to do things which you would prefer not to do. Such is the nature and the reality of selfless love. And when you look at monasteries, you look at the monks or the nuns who are gathered there, and often they are very strong individual characters. They're the sort of people who've often received doctorates at university, who've won the military cross, who've been war heroes, who have made their way in the city of London. Strong, creative people, strong characters. You put 20 or 30 men living together who don't necessarily choose to live to each other because they're not friends, but they have to develop another kind of friendship, a friendship which in fact we heard about last week from Brother John. So living in community as monks, as nuns, is a great call to selflessness, to looking out for the other, to going the extra mile. And often when you look at the monastery from the outside, you go and perhaps spend a retreat weekend at the monastery, and you see these intensely individualistic people, but you see they have a tremendous bond of charity and of fraternity. So the call to radical selfless love, because in our world, when we talk about love nowadays, is often, well, I want to do this, and this is what I mean by love, and I'm going to do it, as opposed to a love which comes from the emptying of the self, effectively the love of Christ. So, monastic life, and then the reality of these last 2 or 3 years. What have I noticed in this time? And this is perhaps where I'm trying to, in a sense, to propose a little bit of an answer to myself. Is monasticism relevant to our time? What we had here in St. Patrick's, and some of you were very involved with this time, is that essentially because of what the civil authorities asked us to do, we kept on feeding the homeless out on the streets, and what we were able to do at the same time is that we took the life of the church onto the streets. So we took Lectio Divina, we took the Blessed Sacrament, we took confession, we took Divine Mercy. In other words, that we did not allow any authority, civil or ecclesiastic, to close us down. We kept open. Now, why we were able to do so was that we often say that God writes straight lines with our crooked lines. That the Lord gave us this opportunity to, in a sense, to live the life of the church on the streets. And that was very, very important. It was important for us, it was important for the poor and the homeless and the disenfranchised who came to us. They really saw that somehow God had not forgotten them, because for them they didn't have the opportunity of a nice cozy flat, of working from home, of being furloughed or whatever. They were still living on the streets and surviving on the streets. And they had a real sense that the church had not deserted them. Secondly, what was very important, what I've noticed in this time, is the great desire that people have for what we call adoration. Now, some of you may not be familiar with what adoration is. As Catholics, we believe that in the Mass, the bread and the wine become the body and blood of Jesus. In other words, that Jesus, the Blessed Sacrament, is truly present on the altar. And that when we go to adore, we are adoring God. Now, adoration and worship and praise is something which is essential to our lives. Why did we enjoy so much the Platinum Jubilee? We loved saying to the Queen that we think she's a jolly good fellow, that she's done a wonderful job. And there was a sort of sense of praise, of worship in that, of a kind. If you look at how people watch the great stars of our time, film stars, the Elon Musks of this world, the football stars, Djokovic winning yesterday at Wimbledon. I mean, we applaud these people. We like our heroes, that there is something in us integral to our humanity that wants to worship. Now, the true worship is what, in a sense, monasticism is all about, which is that call to empty yourself all the time in the liturgy. Thirdly, what I've noticed in these last 2 or 3 years, is that particularly young people who in many ways have everything compared to what my generation had in terms of being able to travel, being able to spend, being able to engage in any kind of expression of sexuality, of gender, or whatever, who have everything, if you like. Even though they have everything, they don't actually have anything at all. And the world is very formless, it's very unstructured, and it doesn't answer some of the very fundamental questions of to what it means to be human. Who am I? What is the purpose of life? What is the meaning of life? One of the things which is, interesting, is that I find that young people, and this is a very niche subject, I suppose, for us as Catholics, are drawn ever more to a much more structured and traditional form of worship. The free spirit of a more of a sort of charismatic life isn't always the number one priority. People are drawn to a place in which they can feel safe and secure, and they don't have to worry about lots of extraneous elements. And I've seen that happen during the time of COVID. The world was kind of shaken upside down, and all the things which were sort of, I suppose, normal were taken away. And therefore that there was a hunger for something that gave them structure and form. And of course, in many ways, that is what monasticism was about. You go back to England in the 10th century or the 6th century, it was a place of tremendous wildness, of insecurity, of fear, if you like, of anxiety. And people were drawn to monasticism because it gave them a structure and a security in which they could express themselves more freely and more individually. It's a little bit like, I always think it's a bit like uniforms in school. There's always a great temptation to get rid of uniforms in school so people can express themselves more freely. But in truth, you go to school where the children are very structured in how they wear uniforms and behave, and you see much more individualism. If you don't have to pretend to be something that you're not, you're more able to express yourself. And that is the great thing about the structure of monasticism, is that it brings a timetable, it brings parameters, it brings walls, it brings safety nets to our world. And I think the last thing that I noticed, and this goes back to Bob Geldof, really, Making Poverty History. Jesus, of course, says the poor will be with you always. But monastic life and monasteries were always traditionally the places where the poor were cared for and fed and watered. One of the great sayings of St. Benedict, who we celebrate today, is receive the guest who comes to your monastery as though he is Christ. So someone can come to the monastery, bedraggled, tramp-like, smelling of alcohol, and Benedict says, you have to receive that person as though he's Christ. In other words, you sit him down, you give him a nice meal, you feed him, you wash him, you care for him, and then after a few days, you send him on his way. To recognize the presence of Christ in the poor is another great teaching of monasticism. And it's something which I think particularly here in St. Patrick's, where we've always done this work, but particularly during the pandemic, we were asked to increase our activity considerably. So, does monasticism have a part to play? Is it an antidote to our time? Is it an answer to our times? That's my question for you. Perhaps to put even more simply, if you haven't, would you like to visit a monastery and stay there?